The oak tree in the backyard was the first thing she noticed. I watched her from the kitchen window as she stepped out of her car, that same unhurried way she always moved, like the world owed her a moment to catch up. She stood at the end of my driveway and looked up at the tree, the one I'd planted the year our son turned 5, the one that now stretched 40 feet into a clear October sky, and I could tell from the way her shoulders went still that something had shifted in her chest. She didn't know I was watching. She rarely thought about what I might be doing. That was always the thing about my ex-wife. Not cruelty exactly, more like a blind spot where I was supposed to be. I should back up. My name is not important. What's important is that I am 63 years old. I live in a 4-bedroom house on a quiet street in Naperville, Illinois, and 3 weeks ago, my ex-wife stood in my kitchen and couldn't finish a sentence. We were married for 22 years. We raised a son together. We built what I thought was a life, and then she decided it wasn't the life she wanted anymore, and she left. That's the short version. The long version takes a little longer, and it matters, so stay with me. Her name was Brenda. I'll call her that because that's her name. I stopped dancing around it a long time ago. We met in 1987 at a company Christmas party in downtown Chicago. I was 31, working as a civil engineer for a mid-sized firm that did highway infrastructure contracts for the state. She was 28, a paralegal at a firm 2 floors up in the same building. She laughed at something I said before I'd even finished saying it, which I thought was either very good or very bad, and I spent the next 4 months trying to figure out which. We got married in 1989. Our son Patrick came in 1992. For a long time things were good. Not perfect. Nobody's marriage is perfect, but good in the ways that matter. We had a routine. We had inside jokes. We had Sunday mornings with bad coffee and the newspaper spread across the kitchen table and Patrick doing his homework on the floor because he claimed the carpet helped him think. Then, somewhere in the early 2000s, something started to change. I felt it before I could name it. She became restless, dissatisfied. She'd gotten her law degree at night school in the late 90s, passed the bar on her second try, and by 2003 she was a junior associate at a firm in the Loop. She was good at it, better than good. And I was proud of her, genuinely proud. But somewhere in that rise, she started looking at me differently. Not with contempt. Not at first. More like impatience. Like I was a piece of furniture that had been in the wrong place for years, and she just now noticed. The engineering firm I'd been with for 16 years had gone through 2 mergers and a round of layoffs. I landed at a smaller outfit in the western suburbs. Good work, solid pay, nothing glamorous. I drove a 4-year-old Chevy Silverado. I coached Patrick's little league team on Saturdays. I made dinner on Tuesdays and Thursdays because those were her late nights. She started saying things. Small things at first. You could have gone further if you'd pushed. Did you ever think about what you might have done with a different mindset? Once, after a dinner party at a colleague of hers, she said in the car on the way home, you don't have to talk about the 85 Bears every time someone asks what you're passionate about. I laughed it off. That was my way. Then in 2007, she asked me for a divorce. I won't pretend it didn't knock the wind out of me. It did. Patrick was 15. He found out on a Tuesday evening and went straight to his room and didn't come out until breakfast the next morning. And when he came down, he just looked at me and said, "So what happens now, Dad?" And I didn't have a good answer. The divorce took 8 months. Our attorneys, her attorney and the one I hired, negotiated the house, the accounts, Patrick's arrangement. We'd owned the house together, a 3-bedroom colonial in Wheaton that we'd bought in 1996. I agreed to let Brenda keep it through Patrick's high school graduation, to minimize disruption for him. She would refinance in her name after that. I would receive a buyout for my half of the equity, about $87,000 at the time, within 30 days of refinancing. That was the agreement. That was what I signed. What happened was something else. When Patrick graduated in 2009, I expected the refinance to happen. I waited. I reached out. Brenda's attorney sent a letter explaining there were complications with the lending environment, which, to be fair, was not a lie. 2009 was not a great year to refinance anything. But months passed. then a year, then 18 months. During that time, Brenda had begun dating a man I'll call her boyfriend, a real estate attorney named Dennis, who seemed to have very strong opinions about what constituted a legally binding timeline. The short version, I never received the $87,000. The long version involves a period of time when I questioned nearly every decision I'd ever made in my adult life. Because that is what it feels like when someone you trusted for 22 years looks through you like you're not there. I talked to a lawyer. My lawyer at the time told me I had a case, but that it would be expensive, contentious, and slow. He said, "You'd probably win, but you need to ask yourself what winning costs." I thought about Patrick. I thought about the fact that he was 20 years old, trying to figure out who he was, and the last thing he needed was his parents turning a civil case into a war. I made a decision that some people, maybe most people, would disagree with. I let it go, not because I was weak. At least I don't believe it was weakness. I let it go because I'd done the math on what that fight would take out of me and out of my son, and I decided there were better ways to spend the next decade of my life. I moved into a rented apartment in Lyle, 2 bedrooms, $950 a month, carpet that smelled faintly of the previous tenant's dog. I set up Patrick's room exactly the way he liked it. Poster of the 2008 Cubs, desk facing the window, lamp with the cracked base that he refused to let me throw away. He spent weekends with me through his freshman year of college. We watched a lot of football. We ate a lot of takeout Thai. I went quiet. That's the only way I know to describe it. I went quiet in a way that people in my life mistook for defeat. I heard through mutual acquaintances that Brenda had a version of our story, a version where I had coasted through our marriage on her ambition, where I had never really tried, where the comfortable life we'd built had been built primarily by her. In her version, she had rescued herself from a man who was going nowhere slowly. I didn't fight it. I didn't call anyone to offer corrections. I just went quiet and started working. I picked up a second consulting contract, weekend work for a county infrastructure project downstate. I had a small amount in savings that I'd kept entirely separate, not hidden, just separate, a habit I'd had since my 30s. And I made some decisions with it that turned out to be the right decisions. I'm not a financial genius. I want to be clear about that. I bought index funds during a period when index funds were historically low, and I held them, and I worked, and I saved, and I did not spend money on anything that wasn't necessary. I also, in 2013, got my contractor's license. This wasn't a grand plan. It started because I'd been doing work on the Lyle apartment, minor repairs, improvements that the landlord allowed because I was handy, and he didn't want to pay someone. The landlord mentioned to a neighbor, the neighbor mentioned to a neighbor, the neighbor mentioned to someone else. I started doing weekend jobs, a bathroom remodel, a deck rebuild, a basement finish. Within 2 years, I had more work than I could handle on weekends alone. In 2015, I left the engineering firm. I started a small contracting business. Just me and 2 guys I'd known for years. Good tradesmen, honest. We did residential remodeling in the western suburbs. We were not the cheapest. We were not the flashiest. We were the ones who showed up when we said we would and finished what we started. In a market full of contractors who did neither of those things, it was enough. Patrick by this point had graduated from University of Illinois with a degree in kinesiology and was working at a sports medicine practice in Naperville. We had lunch every 2 or 3 weeks. He was careful, around me, not to talk too much about his mother's life. I think he'd been doing that since he was 16 and had decided it was the kindest approach. I appreciated it without ever saying so. In 2018, I bought land, an acre and a third in Naperville, in a neighborhood I'd driven through for years on my way to job sites. The lot had been sitting for 7 years, too irregular, the previous owner's estate tangled in probate. I paid $210,000 for it, which was low for what it was, because nobody else had the patience to wait out the title issues. I had patience. Patience was one thing I had in abundance by then. I spent the next 2 years building a house on that land. I did not build it alone. I had my crew and subcontractors I trusted, and a structural engineer from my old firm who owed me a favor or two. But I was there every day. I framed walls. I ran electrical alongside the licensed electrician. I tired the master bath myself, on my hands and knees at 60 years old, listening to a Cubs game on a job site radio on a Tuesday afternoon in September. The house was finished in the spring of 2021. 4 bedrooms, 3.5 baths, a study with built-in shelves floor to ceiling, a kitchen with an 11-foot island and windows that face east, so the morning light comes straight in, a covered porch in the back with a ceiling fan and a view of the yard, and the oak tree, the one I dug up from the Wheaton house by the roots in the winter of 2008, wrapped in burlap, kept alive in a container for 3 years in my apartment complex's small courtyard until I had a place to put it. The property manager thought I was eccentric. Maybe I was. I moved in on a Saturday in April. Patrick brought pizza and his girlfriend, a physical therapist named Abby, who had the good sense to say very little and look around the house with wide eyes that told me everything she was thinking. "Dad," Patrick said, standing in the kitchen looking out at the yard. "Dad." He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. "I should tell you about how Brenda found out." I didn't announce anything. I didn't post photos. I have a Facebook account that I use approximately 4 times a year, mostly to acknowledge Patrick's birthday posts. My social footprint is small by preference. What happened was Patrick's engagement party. He proposed to Abby in February of 2022. They planned an engagement party for May, and they wanted to host it at my house. Patrick's idea, not mine, though I didn't object. He wanted people to see it. He was proud in the way that kids are proud of their parents when they feel like the world hasn't given that parent enough credit. And I understood that even though it made me uncomfortable. The party was on a Saturday afternoon. About 40 people, Abby's family, Patrick's friends from college and work, a few of my old colleagues. Brenda was invited because Patrick loved his mother and wanted her there, and because after 15 years, the particular shape of my damage had healed into something that could coexist with a Saturday afternoon. She arrived with Dennis. I watched them from the kitchen window. Dennis is a tall man with the particular posture of someone who has spent 30 years being right in rooms full of people. He got out of their car, a newer model Audi, and stood for a moment, and I watched his expression as he looked at the house, and it was the expression of a man recalibrating something. Brenda got out, and that's when I saw what I told you at the beginning, the way she went, still under the oak tree. The way her shoulders stopped. I went out to greet them. It's what you do. Patrick was beside me, grinning, because he had engineered the entire afternoon to arrive at precisely this moment, and he wasn't subtle about it, and I loved him for it. "Gerald," Brenda said. She'd called me that for 30 years, and it had always sounded comfortable in her mouth, like a worn-in shoe. Standing in front of my house, it sounded like she was reading it off a card. "Good to see you, Brenda." I shook Dennis's hand. He had a firm handshake. I matched it. She came inside. I watched her the way you watch someone when you've had years to get past the part where their reactions still hurt you. She moved through the kitchen slowly, her hand resting for a moment on the island, looking at the shelves I'd built, the windows, the morning light still soft at 2 in the afternoon. "You built this?" she said. "My crew and I, yes?" She nodded. She looked out at the porch. "At the oak tree." "That's your tree," she said. It wasn't a question. I moved it when I left the Wheaton house. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I didn't know you'd kept it." "I kept it." At some point during the afternoon, she found Patrick, and they sat together on the porch for a while. I could see them through the window talking. Patrick was leaning forward with his elbows on his knees the way he does when he's being serious. Brenda was looking at the yard. Later, near the end of the party, she came to find me. I was in the study showing one of Patrick's friends the shelving I'd built. They left, and she stepped in and stood in the doorway. "You did well," she said. Not warmly, not with apology, more like an assessment she had no choice but to make accurately. I said thank you. She looked at the shelves for a moment. Then she said, "I used to tell people," and she stopped. I waited. "I used to tell people that you never really applied yourself." She said it evenly, like she was reading back a deposition, "that you were capable, comfortable." That was the word I used, comfortable. I didn't say anything. "I want you to know," she said, "that I was wrong about that." It was the closest she'd come to saying what she meant, and we both knew it, and the room held it between us for a second before she turned and went back to the party. I stayed in the study for a little while. I looked at the shelves I'd built. I thought about the apartment in Lyle, the carpet that smelled like someone else's dog, Patrick's lamp with the cracked base. I thought about the $87,000, about the 8 months I'd sat across from lawyers in conference rooms, about the evenings I'd driven back to a two-bedroom apartment in the dark and stood in the kitchen and had the distinct sensation of being at the bottom of something. I didn't feel victorious. I want to be honest about that because I think there's something a little dishonest about a story that ends with a man feeling triumphant because his ex-wife saw his house. That's not what this is. What I felt was more like completion, like a sentence I'd been writing for 15 years had finally gotten its period. Patrick and Abby got married last June at a venue outside of Barrington, a place with a barn they'd converted into a reception hall and white oak tables and string lights strung from the rafters. I danced exactly once, badly, to a song I didn't know, and Patrick filmed it on his phone, and I'm sure it's somewhere on the internet now. Brenda and I sat at separate tables and were polite when we crossed paths and watched our son marry a woman who makes him a better version of himself. And that was what the day was about. I am 63 years old. I still work, 4 days a week now, not five, because I'm old enough to know the difference. I have a contracting business that employs 7 people, which I never planned, but am proud of. I have a house I built with my own hands, on land I had the patience to wait for, with an oak tree that has survived 2 moves and 40 years, and is, as of this past spring, showing new growth on the east side that I've been watching with more attention than I'd ever admit to anyone out loud. Patrick calls every Sunday, not because I asked him to, just because he does. Some evenings I sit on the covered porch and watch the yard go dark and think about the version of myself that drove home to that apartment in Lille at the end of a long day and stood in the kitchen and wondered how he'd gotten there. I don't feel sorry for that version. He was doing what he had to do. He just couldn't see it yet. There's something I've learned in 63 years about the difference between people who doubt you and people who know you. Brenda didn't doubt me out of malice. She doubted me because she'd stopped looking. And you can't make someone look at you. You can only do the work and wait and trust that what you build will eventually be its own argument. The oak tree is 40 feet tall. The morning light comes straight in through the east windows. My son calls on Sundays. That's the whole story. That's everything. I've had a lot of years to think about what actually happened, not the surface version, not the one where I'm the wronged husband who got the last laugh, but the real version underneath that. The truth is, Brenda wasn't entirely wrong about me. Not in 2007. I had gotten comfortable, not lazy. I worked hard. I always worked hard. But comfortable in a way that meant I'd stopped asking myself harder questions. I'd stopped pushing at the edges of what I thought I was capable of. She felt that, even if she named it wrong and used it as a weapon instead of a conversation. What she didn't account for was what happens to a man when he loses everything that was propping him up and has to find out, on his own, what's actually underneath. That apartment in Lyle was the making of me. I hated it for the first year. I used to sit in the kitchen after Patrick went to bed and feel the particular silence of a life that had been rearranged without my consent. But somewhere in that silence, I started doing something I hadn't done in a long time. I started listening to myself, not the version of myself that had been reflected back through someone else's disappointment, the actual one, the one that knew how to build things, the one that had always known. Cause and effect is not complicated, even when it feels like it is. I made choices, not dramatic ones, not a single moment of deciding to change my life. Just small choices, repeated over years. Show up, do the work, don't spend what you don't have, keep the tree alive. Every one of those choices had a consequence, and the consequences stacked, slowly and without fanfare, until one day I was standing in a kitchen I'd built with my own hands, and my son was looking at me the way I'd always hoped he might. That's how it actually works. Not fate, not luck, not some invisible force balancing the scales of justice. Just a man making daily decisions about who he was going to be, and those decisions eventually becoming something you could walk through and touch. What I want to say about Patrick is this. The reason he turned out the way he did is not because I was a perfect father. I was absent in ways I regret. I was distracted during his teenage years by the wreckage of the divorce. But I showed him something without meaning to. I showed him that you don't stop, that when the ground shifts under you, you find your footing and you keep going. He watched me do that from the time he was 15, and I think it taught him more than anything I ever said out loud. The $87,000 still stings, if I'm being honest. I don't think the choice I made was wrong, but I also don't pretend it was nothing. Some costs are real costs. What I've learned is that you can absorb a real cost and still come out the other side, not despite the loss, but partly because of it. Losing that money made me build differently, made me more careful, more precise, more determined not to be in a position where someone else held that kind of leverage over me again. Brenda said I was comfortable. She meant it as an insult. I've spent 15 years turning it into a standard instead. When she stood in my study and told me she'd been wrong, I didn't feel vindicated. I felt tired in the good way. The way you feel at the end of a long project when the last nail is in and the work holds. That's all it was. The work held. I'm 63. I still get up early. I still show up. And the oak tree this spring put out new growth on the east side that I've been watching every morning from the porch with a cup of coffee and more quiet satisfaction than I'll ever admit to anyone who isn't reading this right now.